Okay, so let's begin our City Council work session and joint meeting with the Historic Preservation Commission and Planning and Zoning Commission on Thursday, May 10, 2018. I want to tell you that Rockney Cole cannot join us today due to a conflicting court case, and Susan Mims is running just a few minutes late, so she'll appear and sit down and join us. Be good to introduce each other, so just state your names, please, as we go around this way. John?
John Thomas.
Pam Michaud.
Ann Frericks.
Jenny Swaim.
Thomas Agron.
Sherry DeGraw.
Cecile Grinsley.
Frank Wagner, and I guess this means we're on Historic Preservation Commission, the yellowish one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kevin Boyd.
Jody Theobald.
Max Parsons.
Zach Bilto.
GT Carr.
Mazahar Saleh.
Kingsley Botchway.
Sorry.
Pauline Taylor.
Frank, maybe it means the paper's older.
Easy.
Just a little bit. All right, so let me thank all of you commissioners for meeting with us today, including Mark Sines, who's coming in right now. I can't remember having a joint meeting involving, 20 people or whatever the number is here. I want to briefly recap why we asked you to meet with us. And Eleanor, as usual, please correct me if I go awry in anything I say. Yeah. So at the council's April 15 meeting, we tentatively indicated that a majority, but not a supermajority, of the council favored historic landmark designation and rezoning for the houses at 319 East Bloomington and 412 North Clinton, because owners had filed a petition, a protest. A supermajority is required for council approval. Since the Planning and Zoning Commission had recommended approval, we are required to offer to consult with that particular commission. We also thought it would be wise to make a similar offer to the Historic Preservation Commission, though we are not required to do so. Yeah. I also want to provide a little bit of guidance to those of us on the council. Each of us in the end, not tonight, each of us in the end needs to clearly articulate the rationale for our votes regarding the designations, especially if we intend to vote in different ways with regard to the two houses. Voting for landmark designation because one values historic preservation over an owner's preferences is legitimate. Likewise, voting against designation because one values the owner's rights more than preservation is also legitimate. So too is supporting action that involves some kind of win-win synthesis. What is not legitimate is to treat the two properties differently without having a clearly stated rationale for doing so. Last, we're not going to be making any formal decision tonight. Instead, we are seeking information that will enable us to make the best possible decision when we meet next Tuesday night. So with that, our thought is to begin with Bob Mickove, who will review the situation concerning both houses, right? You're going to do both at one time, or are you going to do one of them first? One at a time. Okay.
What's your preference?
Well, that'd be fine. Let's do it that way. So we're going to do which one? We're going to do
Bloomington Street first.
Bloomington Street first, and then we'll process it, and then turn to the Clinton Street property. Bob.
At your council meeting, you asked for some information about zoning for this block and what the potential.
I'm not hearing your voice as if it was actually being amplified.
Okay. At your last council meeting, you asked us to do a zoning analysis of this particular block and what might happen to the properties surrounding the Bloomington Street if it is designated as a landmark. I would point out that and we look primarily at this half of the block, the north half, which is all zoned CB2, which is our central business service zone. There is an existing landmark on the same lot, the haunted bookshop on Gilbert Street. The CB2 zone is a commercial zone that allows residential on the upper floors. It allows a floor area ratio of 2 and a maximum height limit of 4. And that's somewhat a complicated zoning tool that would indicate for a floor area ratio of 2, you could take the site and cover the entire site with a 2-story building, or you could take the site and cover half of it with a 4-story building. It's the ratio of the building footprint to the land that has a maximum of 2. There is a bonus provision that could allow it to go up to 3 if certain things are done with the development. We looked primarily at the lot that's used by Poly-Eyes for parking because it has the most development potential. It was also the easiest to apply the zoning code to. I would point out that these are very conceptual. We didn't have a lot of time or a lot of information on these properties, so it may be possible that a more dense development could occur. It may be possible that a less dense development could occur, but based on similar properties with the same zoning, this is what we think is a likely scenario, or a couple of likely scenarios for this property. To maximize development potential, we believe that a developer would put parking underground, and that's been done elsewhere in the CB2 zone. So we laid out what the maximum number of spaces could be achieved underground, and then we also looked at what could be achieved on the ground floor. There are some zoning standards that say that you cannot have parking within 30 feet of the street. The idea is to put a storefront along the street. So we did a scenario showing how someone might maximize the residential development potential of the property by putting as much of the property towards parking as allowed by zoning. And in that scenario, we think there's the possibility of one level of below-ground parking, the back of the site having a surface parking lot, and then a building built along the street and then partially over that parking lot. We estimate that with this scenario, there'd be the possibility of 92 parking spaces, which would support roughly 48 bedrooms in 1, 2, or 3-bedroom combinations. So the point of this illustration is to show the scale of the building that might occur adjacent to the potential historic landmark. The second scenario, we looked at this as if a developer was trying to maximize the commercial potential of the property. In that case, they would not put as much of the ground floor into parking, but would do more commercial square footage. The underground parking would be the same. And in that scenario, we estimate that there would be a total of 74 parking spaces, which would support roughly 30 bedrooms, either in 3, 2, or 1-bedroom combinations. And the reason for the less square footage is because there's more commercial space, therefore more of the parking is devoted to commercial and less parking is devoted to residential. Therefore, the building may end up actually being smaller under this scenario. One other thing to keep in mind is that we do have some form-based code standards in our CB2 zone that require that large buildings be broken up into a smaller scale. This is an example of a building in this very same neighborhood built to the CB2 standards. Those standards require that there be storefront windows, that there be some articulation of the building, that rather than having one long unbroken building, that there be some setbacks or relief to the building facade. So again, just to illustrate, this is the sort or type of development that we would anticipate in this neighborhood. There's also in nearby another recent building, a two-story building with the third floor step back on a smaller property in the neighborhood. And there are two smaller properties in the same block. This is the proposed landmark, the existing landmark, and then two dwellings that are currently owned by Mercy Hospital. If these are to redevelop, it would likely be that smaller building scenario. Looking at those buildings, it's going to be more difficult to develop them individually. Someone would most likely have to buy two of them to do much of any development on those properties. And again, given the zoning standards, the types of buildings we've seen recently in the CB2 zone is what you would likely see in terms of scale. So I think that my main point is that even with the existing CB2 zone, the scale of the buildings is reasonable compared to the two-story potential historic building. As you know, we have been working with Opticos, a consulting firm, and we are looking at the potential of doing more form-based codes in this area, which may further refine what's allowed. I'd be happy to try to answer any questions about what I've covered so far.
I have a question, Bob. So the owners of the Bloomington Street building own property that has a newer annex in the back. Would they have any redevelopment potential? And if they did, what would be the constraints on it?
Yes, I'm sorry I don't have a slide showing it. Maybe we do. Well, you see that. But all of this is new construction, and this is a surface parking lot. If this was designated a landmark, it would be possible to take that part of the building off and rebuild on the back side of the lot. And again, similar to the scenarios for the two smaller lots, it would likely be a smaller scale building than what you would see on the Polly-Eyes lot. And again, the zoning would be commercial on the ground floor. In this case, it might be possible that the whole ground floor of the addition could be devoted to parking because it is far enough back from the street that the zoning code allows that. And then the upper floors could be residential.
Okay, so there would be anyhow. I'm not saying anybody wants to do this, but just to make sure I understand, the owners of the property could redevelop that property in the back while still complying with the historic landmark designation.
Right. There would be a design review by the Historic Preservation Commission to help assure that the new addition would be compatible with the historic building.
What I'm thinking is we could turn to the Historic Preservation Commission in a second and ask General to explain why they're recommending landmark designation, and then maybe to Ann, and so that Ann could say why you recommended approval of the rezoning. But are there any other questions for Bob?
Maybe one, does open space play a role in any of this? I know that newer building that you showed has a rooftop garden. Are there some type of stipulation for that in the CB2?
In the CB2 zone, we currently do not have a requirement for open space. We do in our riverfront crossing zones, and some form-based codes do, but there currently is not a requirement.
Okay.
In the spirit of brainstorming and not leading to any particular conclusion here, I've heard some talk about some interest in exploring the feasibility of possibly establishing an urban park of some kind on part of Paguyai's property, if in fact it gets to the point where they're interested and so on. So in the hypothetical, if, say, half of their lot, or maybe a third of their lot, would be designated for an urban park, Am I correct in assuming they would still be, the owners would still be constrained by the zone, the CB2 zoning in terms of height and et cetera?
Would this be a public park or a private park?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking a public park probably dedicated.
Yeah, under our current code, yes, devoting part of this property to a park would reduce the amount of parking and therefore the amount of commercial and residential square footage that would be possible.
Okay. Any other questions for Bob? All right, if not, let's hear from Jenna Lee about why the commission recommended landmark designation. Yeah.
Well, first I want to thank the commissioners for coming early. We have another meeting at 6:30, and two were not able to come. We recommended designation of this house because we were holding true to our commitment to the preservation plan. Goal 1 is identifying historic resources significant to our past. And in the preservation plan, Goal 10 is adopt strategies to preserve historic neighborhoods which reflect their organic development, historical roles and traditions, modern needs and economic health and stability. And Goal Objective 6, incorporate historic preservation efforts in planning for the North Side Marketplace Retail District. And that plan specifically refers to this house as a significant historic property. We also designated it because it meets the criteria of a landmark. So in the process for that, in 2015, at the request of council, that we created a subcommittee which began an extensive process of proactively identifying historic resources. And as Objective 3 of our preservation plan directed, prioritizing the most important or threatened resources. And we believe that because this is in the marketplace where there is space that could be developed upon, that this is a threatened resource. The house clearly meets the criteria that are required and more. It's significant to American or Iowa City history, architecture, archaeology, and culture, well, history and architecture. It possesses integrity of location, design, setting, materials, and workmanship. This is a very intact example of an Italianate house. It's associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history, and in that case, it's because of the brewing industry, which was very big in Iowa City in the 1870s and 80s and 90s, and I think I detailed some of that at the public hearing, and also in terms of the roles of the German and Czech immigrants in the neighborhood. And it's associated with lives of persons significant to our past, that being Conrad Graf, one of the brewers. It's important to know that we are not trying to save every old house. That's not our intent at all, but only the ones that rise to this level of significance. And as I said, it's an extremely intact example of that. There are some other points I'd like to make at some point, but these are the reasons in terms of following our mandate and criteria that we recommend at Landmark.
You said upon the request of the council.
This was in response to the...
You want to elaborate just a little bit?
Sure. So there were 3 historic Civil War era cottages on South Dubuque Street that were going to be torn down for development, and they had been actually identified for some time in the comp plan, I believe, but despite a huge effort by the community and preservationists, we did not win those cottages, and they were taken down. And it was quite a unfortunate controversy, and and we don't like having controversies over Iowa City. And in response to that, as I understood it, the council asked us to make sure we're proactively identifying these houses so that we're not trying to do 11th hour saves of houses. Is that how you remember it?
It is.
Okay.
I know Susan was on the council then, too. Were you, Kingsley? Yeah.
Okay. So that's when we undertook this process of looking one by one at historic houses and such.
Right. Thanks. Any questions for Genevieve? I think I'd like to ask one more question. So the owner's objecting. So why is the commission, why does it want to proceed with the historic designation despite the fact that the owner's objecting?
Well, we believe the house is a community asset. When you have only maybe a wonderful historic house like this high in terms of significance, it is really part of the community, and it's our job to preserve these houses. We believe that the restrictions on a landmark are quite minimal, and that it can be a very helpful thing for an owner, and that in general it helps the neighborhood and stabilizes the neighborhood. And our job is to protect houses, not necessarily to protect individuals' investments.
To that end, generally, I've been talking to a number of different people that are focused on that particular point as far as the process, not only necessarily being somewhat, I wouldn't say, maybe cumbersome is the word I'm trying to use. I can't remember exactly the word that was used. Cumbersome on the front end just by the identification of the property, not very friendly on the front end as far as identification of the property, and then maybe some miscommunication as far as using your word minimal changes that may occur after historic preservation designation. Can you speak to those pieces as far as like the processes in general, and then also going back to kind of the minimal changes and the miscommunication that may occur?
And I'm sorry if the process seems cumbersome. As I understand it, because this is a zoning overlay, it's the same process as with other zoning changes. So it begins with we send out a letter to the property owner saying that this house is recognized as eligible for the National Register and a historic resource and such, and invite them to a meeting at which we discuss the landmark process. And we did that with the group of them, and one of the owners of this house came to the meeting. And then it goes to, and so there's time for discussion, questions, answers, and so forth. And then the first part is then it goes to our commission, and basically we look at the criteria and our mandate and vote yes or no on recommending it. And then it goes to P&Z, and then on to you. I can't speak to whether it seemed friendly or not. I hope it did. We have about 50-some other individual landmarks in Iowa City, so it's not a new or unknown process. I do think that because it is a zoning change, sometimes zoning seems like something that's burdensome, but it's part of living in a community, and as far as I know. In terms of the minimal, if there is nothing that needs to be done to a house once it's landmarked that isn't required of, your basic maintenance. I mean, if you're cited for neglect or something like that, that would be nothing different for a landmark than it would for any other property. If there is any exterior change that the owner would like to make that would require a building permit, then the person makes an application to our staff and commission, and works with us to come up with the best solution. And often the applicant may have the best solution. We may suggest some tweaks that make it more appropriate for the style. It depends on how practiced the applicant or contractor is. And we provide really fine architectural design service because of our staff person, and sometimes there's a fair amount of work and sometimes there's not very much at all. And depending upon the level of the degree of exterior change, it may be approved just by the staff person or by the staff and myself, which means it's quite quickly. Or if it's a larger project, then it would go to the full commission and probably be decided at the monthly meeting. So does that answer?
It does.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know, as I said last time in the meeting, this is really, the whole thing is very new to me. But I was trying to read the policy that being created by the council for this, to have like those historic preservation for our city. I understand those like really going to be the part of the fabric of Iowa City. That's why I want to do it. But while I was reading, it say also case by case.
Could you say that last?
Like case by case.
Case by case.
Like sometime if the case, you know, you can look at it case by case. I mean,
Yes.
not everything because they are, you know, legible, we just have to move forward to it.
Sure.
And in this case, the owner is rejecting. And what have you done to convince them when they said no? And also why you don't look at it case by case?
Well, we do look at it. I mean, it's not that a house has to have a certain. Let me see how to answer
Well,
that.
there's a plan in place, and I think, if I may, step in a little
Oh,
bit.
please.
Yeah. And we try to take the emotion out of something like this and look at it very strategically as to how it is for the community, and how this, we're just stewards of everything here, all of us around here. It's just, you know, we're in place and time here, and we see these properties go through time. We've identified these properties very specifically. This one is in the comp plan twice. It's in the Central District Plan. It talks about it. It's in Historic Preservation, talks about it. And so because of that, it does call it out very specifically. And so it is, on a case-by-case basis, both of these properties would elevate to that level. Now, the fact that the property owner doesn't necessarily want to go along with that has not always been a part of what we look at for the big picture. If we did that, Iowa City would be a much different place right now, and it would look very different. So I think even looking back, we see the errors that we made, and we see the positive things that we did as well. I was in Boston last week. It's amazing to see the history there. I'm not comparing us directly with that, but every community has its places, its special spots, I think. And it was interesting, I spoke to people from London and their aspect of what's historical, you know. And so it's all about context and how we look at it in our own community, and we come to the plan and how this is the piece, these are the pieces, the tools that we have to make these decisions. And I frankly think there are ways for people to make money with historic properties. I live in a conservation zone. I've never thought anything was outrageous. I've always thought that things were very simply done and easy. That's my experience. So I don't know if I've kind of answered your question, but I try to kind of bring it back to the comp plan. I don't know if you...
Well, I
You
just
looked like you were getting ready.
No,
Go
I just-
ahead,
I
John.
was
You
just
always have
thinking of
something
a
good to say.
question, and that
Yes,
is,
please.
do we have an idea of what percentage of land in Iowa City is under either as a specific landmark or conservation or historic district? What kind of coverage are we talking about?
Be very small.
We don't, but we could calculate that, but I suspect it's probably less than 10%.
For any kind of overlay zone, I think. But as far as landmark, they're minimal. I don't know the list exactly, but.
And you said that both of the houses we're going to discuss tonight are explicitly called out in the comp plan, but I think you referred to
I
something
meant
else?
just the one, yeah.
Just the comp plan.
Just-
yeah.
And if I could answer your other question. We, after the initial meeting with the owners, then the public hearings, the 3 public hearings, as you know, have an opportunity for the owners to speak and such. And so is a very useful tool. We want everybody to be able to speak their piece and talk about it. Because this house, the hearing was held over to continue next week. I did meet with the owner and one of the neighbors who's protesting too, to try and see if there is a way that we can find the common ground to, to just share our opinions. But in the end, we're looking at the house and the long term, and this is a remarkable house, and we would like it to be here for generations after all of us move on to some great space above. Does that help?
What's the zoning designation for that great place?
We don't even think about it. We don't have that here.
No numbers, no numbers.
It's a form-based code.
Very complicated.
Very high, yeah, that's right.
I just wanted to add, before I forget, I'm sorry, I was reading the Historic Preservation Plan, and in the introduction, it does say that the Historic and Conservation Districts offer protection to over 1,100 properties, and that was from 2008, and I don't know if we updated it in 15 or 10 when you did it, but I'm just reading it right here.
But different kinds of protection.
I understand
Right,
that,
yeah.
but yes, just as a point of reference, you can see the maps in there too. I didn't physically count the houses, no.
So generally, I want to kind of restate something that I think I heard you say, or at least my translation. The commission's doing what it is tasked to do.
Absolutely.
It's following existing procedures with regard to its own process and then the rezoning and all that. And it's basing its recommendation on the published specified criteria.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so that's helpful to know. And when you were when you were answering my question about why you would proceed despite the owner's objection, I heard you say the house is a community amenity?
Asset, I think.
Asset, thank you. The restrictions are quite minimal. I want to make sure I write this down. The restrictions are quite minimal. It would help stabilize the neighborhood. What else? I know you mentioned something else.
Well, I think it's sort of a linchpin to the marketplace and the historic character of that, which is a human scale size neighborhood. And it's been there as related to the commercial nature of the neighborhood because the brewer lived there. And that marketplace, I think we all hope that it will continue to protect the human-sized, warm, historic character, even though there certainly will be some additions. And that house is, there are other landmarks, the brewery, the St. Mary's Church, the Union Bakery, the bookstore, Economy Advertising. They are not all right next to each other, so they cannot be a district exactly. But there is, in my mind, a critical mass there, and losing one house might change all of that. So I see it as the marketplace is a community asset, and this is a piece of that.
Thanks.
But my other commissioners may have other things to add.
I think it's one of the rare examples where you see how commercial buildings, commercial structures, and residential structures of equal beauty resided next to each other or within proximity of each other. And I can't think of any place else in town where that would be so. I mean, the house, besides which the house is just drop dead gorgeous. Every time I drive by, I have to be careful because I just swivel to look at it. And as generally said, by its origins, the brewer who built it, and by the materials that were used, it is an integral part of the Brewery Square neighborhood, and to that extent, I think alone, it deserves designation. And our job as commissioners on any commission is to take the long view of what is best for the community and disregard everything. I mean, this house is gorgeous because the owners have maintained it beautifully, but without that designation, it could be gone in 5 days. And so we just think by its nature and its history and its materials and its architectural style, it belongs to that significant area of town which you have already distinguished, and that's why.
Great. Any other questions for Jenny or the commissioners? I have a follow-up question I'll get to after we hear about the second house, but not yet. Okay, Ann?
Well, generally explained it quite well, but we go as a commission to the comp plan. What we look at, our criteria are quite clear, and it does, the comp plan supports the designation of these properties. If we look to the IC 2030 even, there are goals to provide a broad set of goals and objectives for both preservation and change, but when we talk about compatible in development, we want to rehabilitate existing structures and encourage new development on vacant, blighted, or deteriorated properties in these areas. And I think that clearly this structure does not fall into any of those categories. The goal also to support the Historic Preservation Commission's efforts to meet its goals, and this follows in that. I think we can go back further than the cottages. That was the specific time frame where this was kind of an assignment that was given by the community through City Council to the Commission, Historic Preservation Commission, to go out and a plan was put in place, and a commitment was kind of loosely made, I think, at that point to say, we don't want to do this in the 11th hour, like she said, but to actually try to search out and to be proactive. So the commission and the city is following that, and it seems wrong in my mind to try to, at the last moment, then say that we want to put other restrictions or thoughts upon this. I think that a path was agreed upon, and certainly we're not chasing marginal properties. These are only properties that are elevated to a very high level. We can go back and think about the old public library. I mean, that was a building that was had potential to be demolished, and the community came forward, and there was conversation, and in the end, I think a wise decision was made, and the building itself was protected. But it was reused in a way that the owner was able to make money with it, and the lot around it. If you walk back there, the lot around it was able to develop, and so that is something that clearly could be done in this case, I think, as well. There's a way to be able to have that, if you walk past the old public library, you can feel that sense of history, you can understand it, you can go back and look and see it. But it's also become a part of the landscape in a way that people can live there, and it can be student housing as it is used right now. So, and I think we can go back even further to find mistakes that were made and things that were not, when we hadn't preserved. And that's why we're to this point where we're kind of trying to hang on and to really identify key structures, and that's important. So I don't know if that helps, if that's what you're looking for. Yeah.
That's helpful. Any questions for Ann? Or the Planning and Zoning Commissioners, for that matter? I thought I remembered reading in the minutes that there was some discomfort expressed by some commissioners about the rezoning and designation of the site. But in the end, the vote was unanimous, right? It's 5-0. So do we need to know about whatever that discomfort was?
In my past meeting with commission, we've always talked about our vote as a whole and how we support that. But if you'd like to hear from individual commissioners, I'm sure that they could give you information if they want to.
Yeah, I think it'd be helpful to know about any particular discomfort that the commissioners still have or expressed then.
All eyes turn to me. As a realtor, I struggle with property owner rights. And I'm not, and I'll be honest, I'm not always on that side necessarily. I see in this property in particular, I see I guess I don't see this block of historic nature. I see over 50% of the block in a parking lot and other more modern structures. I personally do like, I do value historical properties, and that's the struggle that I'm having, the value of the historical properties versus a landowner's property rights. And one of the things that I've made some notes during some of the comments here, and one of the things that I've always struggled with designating something beyond the owner's wishes is the compensation or lack thereof to that property owner. It seems to me if we make a statement that the community values these properties, then you could continue that statement by saying the community should pay for these properties. And that's a whole nother issue. But I think it's a valid. I do personally think that one of the arguments that the homeowner made at our hearing was, they're concerned about their property values, and I do think this designation on this piece, surrounded by what's surrounding it, does limit the potential for that property value. That's just my personal opinion, and I've not done any. And I've done a lot of great research to back that up, but I certainly could do so. So that's just kind of what I struggled with at our meeting, was the community value versus the homeowner rights, the property owner rights. In an ideal world, it'd be something that we could pick this house up and take it and put it on a lot that was in a more historic neighborhood. The other, which gets back to another point that was made, the other thing that I think there's a difference between a residential property that sits in a predominantly residential neighborhood versus a residential property that sits in the middle of a commercial neighborhood. I think
I'm going to have to disagree with you on that. We could go around and round about this, you and I, but I think that, we think of Faneuil Hall in Boston. That there is a building there that is surrounded entirely by skyscrapers. And people, my husband said, there's just the wonder of to see that building in this place and to feel that sense of history there is an amazing thing. It completely brings you back in time at that moment. That one structure, that one little 3-story, I think it is, building in the middle of that. So to me, a single structure has absolutely nothing to do with it when it comes to something like that. And that's just my personal feeling on it. And if we talked about property values, we could go round and round about that through all the years of all the rezonings, I think, and it's never been anything that we've been asked to take into consideration by staff, and I think that's wise.
I don't want to stimulate an extensive debate, right? I just
But I
wanted
think
to
that-
understand what the objection was.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that this house was once basically in an industrial area, right? It was attached to a brewery that was 6 stories and producing material and probably smelled, and so I think it's part of its history is that it wasn't in a neighborhood. It was in essentially an industrial brewery district, and so I think as we talk about parking lots or not parking lots, like it doesn't seem that the parking lots seem like the modern day equivalent of like an industrial site, a brewery, I guess, that's in a neighborhood. And so I think it's important to kind of remember that this house wasn't really in a neighborhood. It was in a place that was similar to what it is now.
I'd like to add something.
Use the mic.
Okay, thanks. This is Pam Michaud. My mom was raised in Galena, Illinois. It's all historic, and I know that can't happen here, sort of. but I don't trust the parking lot to be there forever because I've seen this movie before behind my house. And now there's a 15-story skyscraper going within a block and a half. And there's a solid block of 4-story building behind my house within 9 feet of my property line. So I have strong feelings about that. And I think that if we regard it as a special landmark, it should be set aside as a jewel. And I think the idea of having more setback is a reasonable compromise on other adjacent properties to make a public park, perhaps, incorporating the front yard. Otherwise, you got this little thing back in an alley between two huge structures. So, yeah, it could still be a law office or a medical office, and the back of the lot could still be developed in a higher scale because of some compensation in height. However, I think to optimize it, the adjacent property owners could set back a little bit, make more of a public space. That's in the ideal world.
Okay,
I do want to
Sounds like
mention
a
one more
possibility.
thing. I think that there's sometimes we've seen this at planning zoning, there's a misconception by people think that you can build, because there have been very tall buildings built in Iowa City, that you can build them in lots of places. And I think it was a wise exercise for you to have staff go through and kind of explain and talk about what actually could perhaps be done in this spot. I mean, we're not talking about hundreds of bedrooms. We're talking about a maximum of 48 bedrooms in that huge area that is a parking lot. So when you look at this, if you're going to talk about trade-off, what you could have on that small lot really is not a substantial number of bedrooms if you're talking about something like that. It's just a point I want to make.
Yeah, and I guess I'd add one other thing with regard to what Mark said. I want to make sure I understand one thing. You're drawing attention to, I guess, the fact that if we designated this property as an historic landmark, that would be constraining the value of the property. And I think that takes, tell me if I'm wrong, that kind of assumes that the nearby property would develop at a scale similar to what Bob put up on the screen for us. And then the landowners would say, hey, we could make more money by demolishing the building and doing something else there. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, yes, I think the value of the other properties surrounding it would be more.
Right, okay. Thanks, I want to know that. And one other comment is that, if I understand correctly, the house is currently being used in a commercial way?
I think so.
Not a residential way?
I think so.
Yeah,
Yes.
all right. Yeah, okay. All right, any other questions for Ann? Yeah. Sorry, Kingsley has to depart for other commitments.
Watch it on TV.
I was going to add that after our meeting a few weeks ago, I guess it was the city council meeting a few weeks ago, I went online and looked at examples of historic architecture with contemporary architecture built around it just to preserve the jewel. They were amazing, exciting examples. And when I think about it now, the footprint of the building isn't that large, and a lot could be done all around it and then keep the jewel. I think the architects in the area would actually think that's an interesting challenge. It could win an award easily if done right, and we would have the benefit of the old building and exciting architecture around it.
Great, thanks. Does anything else have to be said, or any council members want to say anything? Ask any questions? Okay, I think that means we can shift to the Clinton Street house, 410 to 412.
Okay, so this property is zoned RM44, which is high-density multifamily. The properties around it are zoned similar, with the exception of the university across the street, which is zoned for public use. We examined what could be done on this property under the current zoning if the house is removed, and estimate that anywhere between 8 and, there could be up to 8 3-bedroom apartments, 12 2-bedroom apartments, or 24 1-bedroom apartments, provided the parking can be provided on the site. And we weren't able to determine that, but we think that's probably a fair estimate of what could be achieved here. Following the zoning standards, if someone maximized the footprint and the square footage, we estimate that approximately an 18,000 square foot building could be built here. That'd be 18,000 square feet on 3 floors, assuming there would probably be parking in the lower level. If the historic aspect of the property was preserved and the rear modern addition was removed and the rear property was redeveloped, we estimate, using the existing square footage of the house, adding on to it approximately 15,572 square feet of floor area could be developed. This is roughly 87% of what could be done under the maximum if the landmark building is not designated. So yes, there will be somewhat of a diminishment of square footage, but it's not a great diminishment, roughly 13-14%. I would note that the zoning code also provides incentives to keep the building in place if it's a landmark. There are possibilities of waiving some of these other zoning requirements to allow reuse of the property and an addition on the back. Be happy to try to answer any questions.
I was trying to type all that, write it all down, and I didn't catch everything, Bob. So
we can certainly
could you go back over some of the key points, please?
Sure. If it was a vacant site, based on maximizing the zoning potential of the property, we estimate that a 3-story building could be built with approximately 18,000 square feet of floor area. If the building is preserved and the historic part of the building is preserved and the modern rear addition is removed and the existing building is reused and a new building built in the back part of the property, we estimate that approximately 15,572 square feet of total floor area, both the old and the new combined, could be achieved on the property, and that's 86.5% of what could be achieved with total new construction.
Did you say how, thank you, did you say how many, if it's, assuming this is developed residentially, did you say how many units could be provided?
The zoning density, and we're not sure that this could actually be achieved based on the parking, but the maximum zoning density would be 24 1-bedroom units, 12 2-bedroom units, or 8 3-bedroom units, or some combination thereof. But basically 24 bedrooms could be achieved.
If the parking is?
If the parking can be provided.
Thanks, that's quite helpful. Let's go through that same, well, any questions for Bob from council people? All right, I don't hear any. Thank you, Bob. Generally?
Okay, and I want to add one thing that pertains to both this house and the other one, if they were landmarked, as Bob alluded to, as landmarks, there could be some parking requirements waived by the Board of Adjustment for both the house on Bloomington and this house on Clinton. So once again, this is in sub-area A in the Central District Plan, which looks for incentives to maintain, improve, and reinvest in older housing stock. We stuck to our preservation plan, which says identify historic resources significant to our past. preservation plan, the goal 7, establish and implement historic preservation objectives for the UFI campus and surrounding neighborhoods, including avoiding negative impacts on individual historic resources. And goal 10, adopt strategies to preserve historic neighborhoods. So that this house was a result of the same process that we began in response to your directive to be proactive. And as with the other one, we followed Objective 3 of our plan under Goal 1 to prioritize the house's most important or threatened resources. And we believe this, being right next to the university, and is certainly under threat. The house clearly meets the criteria required. It's significant to Iowa City history. It possesses integrity of location, design, setting, materials, and workmanship. There are very, very, very few exterior changes from when this house was built in 1865, we believe. It's associated with lives of persons significant to our past, Dr. Cochran and the Sharpless family and the Dennises. It embodies a distinctive characteristic of a time period or method of construction. Again, we're not trying to save every old house. This one rises to that level of significance. There are perhaps only maybe a dozen at most houses built in the 1860s that are still in Iowa City. And that's pretty amazing when you think about it. 1860s is a very important decade in American history. And we would like to have some houses, particularly that look so much like this one does still, to remind us of that period. This part that I'm talking about now did not come up during our Preservation Commission or your P&C hearing, or of course the public hearing for the council, but I do believe it's pertinent. So since your April 17th public hearing, the ownership has changed of this house. It has been affordable housing for many years under Mr. Crane. We do not know under the new owners what is planned, if they intend to keep the house, if they intend to do something different with the back, if we don't know. And we do know, however, that from the date the City Council sets its public hearing, which was April 2nd, there's a 60-day moratorium on buildings that are being considered for landmarks, in which you can have no development or demolition. That 60-day moratorium ends on June 2nd.
Right, and Eleanor, if I'm correct, after that 60-day period ends, assuming the house has not been designated a landmark, the owner could say put up, request a demolition permit and tear it down in 5 days.
Yes, and there wouldn't, another moratorium or 60-day moratorium would not be allowable for another year.
Right. Okay, so again, generally, I want to ask you why you're recommending designation despite the fact that the previous owner objected. And do I understand correctly that the current owner has also filed an objection?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because, again, we're in this for the long haul. This house has been here since 1865, and we believe it should be here a lot longer. We believe that it has proven that it is a useful house for housing in Iowa City, and that it can continue to be that. That the kinds of restrictions that a landmark would put in place are the basic ones of if the owner wanted to change something requiring a building permit, it would come to us, and the various levels of review are required based on that. We generally, if the owner wanted to do something with the addition in the back, make some changes to that, which would require a building permit. We look at that somewhat differently than to the historic house. We generally are pretty flexible with that, understanding it's not contributing to the historic character of the main old house. So we're doing what we're supposed to be doing and following the criteria and finding that this is a superb example of 1860s Iowa City.
Any other questions for Genoway, from council members? Okay. Ann?
Well, as with the other structure that we talked about this evening, this also meets the requirements that we see as a Planning and Zoning Commission in the comprehensive plan. Now, while it is not called out specifically in the plan, that is never anything that is required or necessary in order for something to meet the comp plan. The research that was done outlines the reasons, and we support that, and we support the mission that the Historic Preservation has put forward here based on what the City Council asked them to do in 2015. And for those reasons, I mean, I don't know if it's neglect or blind luck, but the fact that this building still has all of the details and is the way it is pretty amazing. And I think the fact that it is there where so many students have access to view it and to see it makes it even more important, I think, to have them see part of the community in a way that they otherwise might not be able to, or a place that they might not wander into. And so to me, that even strengthens the idea and the thought of what needs to occur.
Okay. Any questions for Ann?
I don't know this for Ann or for Bob. Yeah, I can remember there is another extension building behind this, and that doesn't has nothing to do with this one. They can do whatever they want to do, even if this being okay. I guess.
Well, a plan would have to be made and an agreement made, but you know that's what was done with the old public library. The addition was removed, and then student housing was built around it. And if you look, you can see it's even, you know, in a curve around the, I don't know the proper term for the architecture of it, but the dome or the
Apse.
Thank you. I knew there was someone here that could. So clearly, this is something that could be accomplished, I think, and it could be a win-win situation. Now, the fact that the property has changed hands, I think, is reason for worry.
How large is the building behind this? Like how big it is?
The existing building?
Behind this.
It is 2 stories. I don't know if we have a really great photo of it. This is probably the best image. So it is 2 stories. I believe it contains 9 one-bedroom apartments.
Which one bigger, the front or the back?
Excuse me?
Which one is bigger than the other?
Larger?
Larger, I mean.
The aerial photo. I think the one in the they're roughly the same size, but the one in the back looks slightly larger.
It has 9 units, and the one in the front has 6.
I think the idea, too, that we're talking about a 13% difference in what could be made if it were completely leveled, and what could be made if there's some type of compromise and decision-making and creative thinking involved is an important thing to note.
And Bob, the occupied space scenarios that you were presenting, neither one included the parking, right? This was just...
That's right.
Any other questions for Ann? Okay. I know I have one residual question, but do any of the commissioners on either commission want to add anything to the discussion we've had so far? Mark?
I'd like to, if I may, for the record, so I'm not labeled as a hater of historic properties, I should point out that I voted, with the exception of 319 Bloomington, I voted in favor of protecting all the other properties that were presented to us, including this one. And the difference to me in this one versus the Bloomington. I just want to share my line of thought. I'm not right or wrong, I'm just sharing my line of thought. The difference is that this one is a residential property surrounded by residential properties. And again, going back to Bloomington, when we look at valuing a property, we look at what's called highest and best use. And that's what led me to be concerned about limiting the highest and best use of the property on Bloomington. We talked through this on the Clinton Street property very significantly, and I tried to help the owner come up with ways that he could maximize his value on the property while maintaining the historic nature, and that did involve demolishing the old building in the back and building a newer building that was more efficient with its space usage. And so that, to me, that was an alternate scenario that allowed that property owner to potentially maintain or increase the value of that property and maintain the historic building on the front half of the property. And that was the difference in the two properties in my mind.
Good. Thanks for saying that.
I would like to add a little bit into my enthusiastic yes vote on both of these. Along with feeling that it met all the criteria within the guidelines that we have, the comp plan, I'm someone who, I make a living by helping people select trees. And I always go for the tree that they're probably not going to get the full beauty. They're probably not going to get the full benefit. It's going to be another generation. And so that's the perspective I come with these houses. And I really would hope that they are there for all the generations of Iowa City. So I just have to add that.
You are taking the long view.
Thank you, Jody, for saying that.
I just look at the preservation work that we have as part of what we do as a city, right? As a city, we come together to share things, roads, parks, protection, all of those things. And we also have a shared history with that. And some of that history is big and grand, and like the old Capitol and the realization of the Pentecrest and news that makes the world with Emma Harvat being the first woman mayor in the country. But some of that history is smaller but no less important. And I think kind of our shared history of the brewers in the Northside the Northside Marketplace and Clinton Street as once a prominent residential part of that history, those are important stories to tell with the big stories as some of the little ones. And so I see our work, these properties in particular, as part of our the stuff that we share as coming together as a city on all the other things and this too. And I know that there are restrictions of property rights, but we do that all the time with zoning. We change what people can do, and we limit what people can do with their properties. Fences can only be so high and all these things. And that's just part of what we decide to do as a community together, as a city. And so I just view these as two pieces of of sharing that story. And to me, there's kind of two things to consider, right? Which is what we're coming back to all the time. Are these properties worthy of historic designation, and do they fit the objective of the comprehensive plan? And in my mind, it's yes on both, for both questions, for both properties. And that seems to me what we're all here to try to do, is to accomplish those things. So that's what I've got.
I'd like to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nicole. I know that these anecdotes can be time consuming and whatever, but sometimes I think that they can also allow us to see something a little bit differently. And I just wanted to respond to that phrase, highest and best use of the property. And if we look anecdotally, I agree with so much of what has been said here this evening, but particularly with the comments right before me. But that phrase, highest and best use, I find funny to have those things linked together. And I just, in terms of looking at the house on Bloomington, I would consider my own story, which is that I went to every single one of my wife's prenatal appointments there for all 9 months of her pregnancy, and we chose that doctor for many reasons, but one of them actually was that it was in that building, and a building that we could walk to from where we lived and everything. And so when you think about like the highest and best use of these historic structures, I would look, I guess, if you look at the north side, I would look at that building, which is occupied, and I chose it, well, we chose it partially specifically for that reason, and then look right across the street to the new development that is there that has been vacant for most of the years since it was built, across the street from the Poly Eyes building. So there is value in using these buildings, even though this might have been residential originally. Using it commercially now does bring great value to that business in a way that obviously, as we look around town, lots of new buildings maybe don't bring that same value to structures. So it's just my own story about that property. Thanks.
Okay, any council members have any other questions?
Right.
Or Pam?
Well, empty
Sorry.
storefronts in modern buildings, I mean, like 2 years of empty storefronts on the first floor do not add value to the community. They deplete the sense of connectedness. Whereas if you had this building, maybe there's not a doctor there 10 years from now, but there's a bistro and there's outdoor patio seating. What does it take to make that ambiance in a new building? It doesn't happen. There's no class in a new building. They destroy the trees, yada, yada.
I do like new buildings sometimes, but I don't like it when they destroy key structures, I think, in our community, so.
Okay, I would like to ask the commissioners whether you see any legitimate reason why we should, or might, we being the council, should or might treat the properties differently.
I think they meet the requirements the same. I mean, they're clearly outlined. I do not think they should be dealt with differently.
Anyone else?
I agree. I agree with Ann.
Yeah, I think we kind of came to that as a commission, that both these properties met all the criteria.
All of them that we went through, yeah. I think to just select two because someone doesn't, who currently is a steward of it disagrees, wouldn't be the wisest decision to make. To clearly to pull those aside and to not designate them for that one reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to chime in? You don't have to.
I wanted to touch on a comment you made, and I guess I'm playing devil's advocate at this point. While we do create many regulations and zoning and code and criteria for structures, it's my understanding for the most part that anything that's existing is typically grandfathered in. And I can, in my mind, kind of equate the same thing. The fact that we have that there may be new ideas of the way things should be done has not limited us in the past from allowing those things that don't meet that criteria to be exempt from those kind of changes. So I don't know, I just felt the need to.
Just to be clear, the commercial use would still be grandfathered in. The historic preservation designation doesn't affect the use of the property?
Right, yeah.
And there's no need to change what's there now, right? They're grandfathered in as they are.
Correct.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but that concept really doesn't apply here. And if it did, there's nothing that has to change about these properties with a designation based on what they currently are.
I wasn't talking specifically about these properties, more about the concept of creating new laws and new codes and how that is applied over time.
We sometimes have downzone properties or changed the zoning, and once it's downzoned, you couldn't add square footage or, so it's, yeah, I'm not sure it's an analogous.
Okay. I'll shut up now.
Oh, darn.
When you designate something as historic, what benefit the owner will get?
Good question.
Well, it's protected. This house is going to stay. It's going, if there are changes that the applicant would like. This person, the owner would have access to really fine, free advice on and direction on how how to choose the best windows if the owner decided to replace the windows, design information and review and advice. As we said earlier, the waiving of parking requirements could happen, so that, because what we're trying to do is not just to preserve these houses, but to continue the use of them. We don't want them to sit empty. We want them to continue to be a vibrant part of the community that people use.
There's also state and local tax credits
Yes.
available for owners of historic properties.
The owner has been getting an income from this property, and that will continue with the landmark designation. It's not being penalized in that sense in any way.
And it would also mean this, the owner, we have a new preservation fund in Iowa City, which, depending on whether it's owner occupied or an income producing, there's money available either as a grant or as a low interest loan, and besides the state and federal tax credits.
And is there any restriction beside don't demolish it for like ever, whatever?
In terms of any exterior changes, but again, that can be a very streamlined process. And I think if you look at the history of all the applications that have come to us for exterior changes, you will find that we have denied, I shouldn't give a number, but I would be surprised if it's more than 4%, and that's a couple of decades worth. And that's because we can work with the applicant and come up with a solution that works for the applicant and that works for the longevity of the house.
Also, the interior is nothing in the interior is ever looked at by the commission or is like with the old public library. I mean, that was really, I think, for the most part, completely changed on the interior. You just don't notice it from the exterior.
I'm seeing, okay.
There are certain circumstances under which an historic landmark could be demolished, right? What are those circumstances?
So for instance, if a tornado hit the house or a fire hit the house, as these things do happen, if the house is judged to be totally irreparable, it cannot be fixed, then the applicant could receive a demolition permit with one other caveat. The applicant would need to give us plans for what she would like to build in place.
Actually, generally, that doesn't
That
apply
not work for a landmark?
That's in historic districts.
Okay.
For landmarks, once the building's gone, then
Okay.
there's no need for the review of that.
Forget that.
Tornado, fire, really bad, yes.
By this time.
Arson is
Just to clarify, I'm sorry, if I could just piggyback on that, just to clarify, you're saying it has to be totally destroyed. So if it's 80%.
No, not totally destroyed.
Who determines that level of destruction and whether or not it has to be replaced, repaired,
In the
replaced?
past, the building official has done it based on some structural defects.
Basically, though, these commissions are kind of part of our structure, our governmental structure, and they've been evolved over decades. Just like the Constitution nationally and the House of Representatives and the Senate, these are part of the agreed-upon structures. Planning and zoning is extremely important, and people have valued historic preservation too nationally. So that's kind of a given. The owner's problem is to be weighed, absolutely.
Okay, I think we've reached the end unless one of our council members wants to say something. Thank you so much for your advice, for the information you provided. It's been very, very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.